Start off with for our frame, let's go ahead and rip down some material into 1.5" by 1.5" strips. Now you can use 2x4s for this, or you can use a 2x6. Personally, I think the best bang for your buck is a 2x6. Once you have a couple of these 1.5" by 1.5" boards ripped down, now let's go ahead and set our saw up to rip 1" strips. Now that we have that, let's head over to the miter saw and cut these to length. So let's start off by cutting our legs out of the 1.5" by 1.5" boards. We're going to be needing 4 of these that are 32 inches long. Then while we're here, let's go ahead and cut our leg braces using the same material. We're going to be needing 2 of these that are 20 inches long. And now for our 1.5" material. Let's cut 4 front and back boards that are 29 inches long, 4 sides that are 20 inches long, and then we'll be needing 3 shelf braces that are 29 inches long. All right, so now that we have our main parts of our frame cut, we need to take the front and back boards of our planter box, as well as the side boards, back to the table saw, cut a little notch in the edge of each board that will hold our side panels. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So to cut these notches, I set my table saw blade to 1/2 inch high. Then I set my table saw fence to 1/2 inch from the outside of the blade. This will give us a 1/2 inch total cut. I'm going to cut a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch notch into each one of my boards. Now if you're using 3/4 material, you would cut a 3/4 by 3/4. Now that we have our first cut made, I'm going to cut each board again, and then I ran each board through on its edge, with the wide part of the board against the table, and the cut part of the board against our fence. This will give us a nice 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch notch. All right, so now that we have all of our main frame parts cut, we have all of our leg parts, we have our side parts, now would be the time that if you want to do any type of staining or painting of this, maybe just to contrast the colors, you would go ahead and do it now. I think that I'm going to paint these black and leave everything else natural. That should really make the natural colors pop. And again, this part's completely up to you. Natural look would look great, but get creative with this. That's what's going to make yours stand apart from the rest. Okay, so now that you have all of your parts stained, painted, however that you would like, now we can move on to the next step for our assembly. And that's going to be the joinery for this. And to attach our front and back and side rails to our legs, I'm going to be using pocket hole screws. So I'll need to cut 2 pocket holes on each side of the boards that I've cut this little notch in. This is going to allow me to attach the boards to the leg. Now the other option, if you do not have a pocket hole jig or you just don't want to use it, is to pre-drill and counterbore 2 screws on the outside. That would probably add a bit more strength. However you decide to do it, it's up to you. But let's go ahead and get these pocket holes cut. Since I only have 1 inch of space to work with here, our pocket holes are going to have to be pretty close. So I'll just cut my first hole as close as I can to the inside edge, then I'll cut my second hole as close as I can get it. And since this material is 1 inch thick, I'll make sure to have my collar set at 1 inch. Alright, so now that we have our pocket holes cut and our front and back boards, which are our longer boards, and our side boards, let's go ahead and set these side parts aside and go ahead and get these front and back boards attached to our legs. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to install a rail at the top of each leg. Then once I get that installed, I'm going to measure down 10 inches to the bottom of the second rail and install that one. And essentially what we're doing is making our front and back assemblies. Then once you have both of the frames assembled, we'll move on to our next step. And for the second leg assembly, I'm going to show you how I would do it if I'm using screws on the outside. I'm going to measure down my board 3/4 inch, make a mark, and then I'll measure down 9.5 inches and make a mark. Then from the side, I'm going to measure up 1/2 inch at each one of my marks. Where these two intersect, that's where I'm going to place my screw. I'd actually use one of my pocket holes on the inside, and then one 2.5 inch screw from the outside. Honestly, I think that this way will be the most stable. Once you have the screw placement for your first board marked, we want to make sure to put our screw holes in a mirrored image on the second leg. So instead of measuring off of this side of our material like we did for the first one, we're going to measure off the far side. This is going to make sure that our screw holes line up. You'll see what I'm talking about here in a minute. Now with our boards marked, we can go ahead and pre-drill and counterbore each one of our holes. And now that we have our holes drilled, we'll just turn our legs so that the holes are closest to the table. Now that we have our placement laid out for our outside screws, let's go ahead and lock this down from the inside, only using the top pocket hole. Now if you're going to be using the screws on the outside, you're only going to need 1 pocket hole screw. Now if you're going to be using this method with a screw on the outside, which honestly I recommend, then you're only going to need 1 pocket hole on each end of these boards. Now that you have your 4 screws on the inside of this, we'll lock everything into place with the 4 screws from the outside. Now that's really tightening everything up. Okay, so now that we have both of these assembled, let's go ahead and cut our fence picket material that's going to set right inside of here, making a panel. So I'm just going to start off by ripping a few pickets down to 2.5 inch strips. Now you really don't have to rip these down if you like the wider board look. But for this build, I think that narrow strips will look better. So now that we have our pickets ripped down, let's head over to the miter saw. Now with my material cut down to 2.5 inches, I'm going to cut these into 48 inch strips. This will be enough to do all of our side panels. And for making repetitive cuts like this, it's always easier to cut more than 1 board at a time. Alright, so now that we have our panel boards cut, we can go ahead and install these onto our front and back sides. And to install these, just like anything else, there are several different ways that you can do it. I'm going to be using wood glue and 7/8" crown staples. Now you can also use brad nails or exterior screws. That'll be completely up to you. And whenever you get to the last board of your panel, we'll rip this board down to custom fit the space that you have left. And these sideboards install super quick this way. And once you have your first one done, we'll just repeat this for the second one, and then we're ready to move on to assembling the rest of this main frame. So to install my side panel frames, I'll be attaching these to the front and back assembly the same way that I did for my frames for the front and back. I'll be using the bottom pocket hole on the insides this time, and then once I get these locked down from the inside, I'll counterbore and install a screw from the outside. We'll get to that here in a minute. So now that I've cut 2 pocket holes in each one of my parts and I've actually assembled this thing, I've decided that you really only need one. The mix of attaching these from the inside as well as through the outside definitely makes a much stronger hold. And before we install our screws from the outside, let's go ahead and attach our front panel to the back panel. So with our 4 side frame boards installed, I'm just going to set this front assembly on top of the back assembly and then lock down my screws. Okay, so now that we have those installed, I'm going to go ahead and put our screws in from the outside. The only difference in these screws versus the screws that we already have in is that this time I'm going to put my screws in at 1/2 inch down and 9 1/4. This is going to keep our 2 screws from hitting each other on the inside of our board.